For the scientist in me, that was very interesting because I was like, okay, I'm observing consciousness without a body. It really ignited my curiosity and opened me up to the possibility that consciousness is not local and that it's not just dependent on a body. Brains are wired for the known. They're wired for what we can recognize. And the awakening journey is wiring you for the unknown, for the mystical, which by definition you can't predict. It always meets you in a new and expansive way. And every time I would have some sort of spiritual breakthrough, my external life would shift. And so that super conscious state, it infiltrates everything in your life. Because how can you look at relationships the same? How can you look at your job the same? How can you look at the earth the same after you've had that experience of oneness?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shifting Dimensions podcast. This is a podcast where we explore the unseen, the unknown, and the transformative moments that shift our understanding of reality. I'm your host, Jumi Moses, spiritual seeker and metaphysical investigator, exploring the mysteries of existence. On the show today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Crystal Cassidy. Crystal is the founder and CEO of SoulPod, a soulfulness app designed to help users explore and transform their inner world. With 2 decades in pharmaceuticals and biotech, she advanced oncology research and genomic diagnostics. However, her path shifted after a near-death experience that deepened her understanding of consciousness. Now a certified Reiki master, breathwork facilitator, Kundalini yoga instructor, she blends scientific expertise with spiritual insight to lead a new wave of soul tech. Through SoulPod, she's making personal transformation and conscious living accessible in today's digital age, championing both individual awakening and collective evolution. Crystal, welcome to Shifting Dimensions. I'm so excited to speak with you today.
I am so excited to be here, Jumi. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I wanted to really make sure that I gave as much of your background as possible in the introduction, because I really want people to understand just how much knowledge you're sitting on from a scientist perspective and also a spiritual perspective. And I love speaking with people like you because I really admire people who are able to blend science and spirituality. And it seems like you have a lot of experience in both areas. So excited to jump into a conversation with you. And I want to start off by talking about your near-death experience, because my understanding is that was part of the catalyst for SoulPod, the app that you created. So can you walk me through how did the near-death experience come about and what was the experience?
Yeah, I love that we're starting with this. Yeah, so I had been meditating since I was 12, on and off, but it was already kind of a foundation of my journey. And I'd started having mystical experiences before this near-death experience, but it wasn't even that too long ago in 2020. But as you can imagine, 2020, what happened, was one of the first people to get ill and was in quarantine. And at that point in time, there really wasn't a lot that people knew how to navigate COVID and that virus. And so it was terrifying. It was, my lungs were shutting down, my cardiovascular system, my neurological system. And there was just so much unknown around me. And interestingly, before that had happened, I had done a meditation intensive in January, and I started having premonitions that this was coming. And I started having like visions of past lives of mine that were connected to what I was about to go through in this very intense experience. And so as it got worse and worse, there was one point where my analytical mind, the scientist in me, which is like always trying to crack the code and understand it, and if you just get the right medicine, then you're going to be fine, and that did not exist. That was not an option. And so at some point by myself, so I was also having to really face this feeling of being without any support. My husband couldn't be back there with me, so it was very isolating. And I just surrendered. And it wasn't like I chose to surrender. It was a moment where it just happened. And then I understood what surrender really meant. It was this really profound letting go of the control, letting go of everything all at one time. And I had noticed that death as an energy was near. And for anybody who's had a near death experience, I hear this sometimes that you recognize that energy. So that was unexpected and very interesting to me afterwards, looking back on it, is it almost felt like a long lost friend. Like you go, oh, I remember you. So I knew death was close and I knew that there was a possibility I wasn't going to pull through. But in this moment of surrender, where I let go of everything, I also simultaneously asked for help. I could feel myself reaching out and saying, I don't think I can do this on my own. And instantly there was a response. And instantly there was a presence in the room. And my energy centers were getting activated. First, my first center, then the space between my eyebrows, my third eye, and then my heart space. It just went kind of like doom, doom, doom. And I was laying there activated in my energy and just feeling so cared for and held. And also this feeling of I was going to make it and I was going to be okay. And I was determined to stay. I was like, I'm not done with my purpose yet. I don't want to go back quite yet. I'm just not ready. And there was a lot of this out of body, out of time experience as well. Time got really confusing. But then there was a secondary experience to this afterwards. I'd gotten home. I was very slowly learning how to walk again. And I had made it one day to my fire escape. This seemed like such a triumph to me at the time. I opened the door. I sat down in the chair. I looked up at the sky, and it was this blue sky I hadn't seen in so long. And I just had this profound moment of peace that really didn't make much sense to me. And fast forward years later, I was in a meditation, a 3-hour meditation, and I astral traveled back to that moment with myself on the fire escape. And so it was future me looking at sick Crystal, and I was just pouring love out to her. And so I realized in that moment, oh, that was future me I was feeling on that fire escape. And so that just really blew my mind as far as what's possible across dimensions of time and how we can literally heal ourselves that way. So those were the kind of big breakthroughs for me in that experience.
It sounds like when you talked about your near death experience, right? When you had your energy centers activated, is that the right word to use?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like there was an activation and you had some sort of up leveling, right? I don't know the extent of that up leveling and I don't want to try to label it, but it sounds like
Yeah.
you were tapping into another realm, dimension almost, because you said that time and space started to feel different to you, right? And a lot of times people hear near death experiences, and it's not like you necessarily crossed over to the other side.
No, I didn't go into the light or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you could sense that that could have possibly been an option for you.
Yeah.
If you were ready for it, but you weren't ready for it. So you asked that you needed a little bit more time here, but you were still having a mystical experience nonetheless. You said that you could feel death near, and you said it felt like an old friend, but kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Outside of it feeling like an old friend, did you, I guess, were there additional feelings to make you feel like I can sense that something's about to happen?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I could feel it the moment I was actually there was so much scrambling at that point in San Francisco where I was at, and I was on the phone with a head of a medical system, and we were just talking about testing, and I was trying to help get things in place at the time. And I knew on that call with him that I was getting sick. And it was almost this kind of instantaneous heaviness. And it wasn't just the virus, it was a feeling of I knew I was about to go into this experience. And I didn't want to I didn't want to go into it. But there was certainly a feeling of anxiety. There was certainly a feeling of resistance, just a massive amount of resistance as you can imagine. I would wake up with resistance and death. I think I could also, if you believe in the many worlds theory, there felt like there was a timeline where I did pass. And I was choosing, like, all these possibilities exist. And what did I want to choose in this timeline? So I could feel, weirdly enough, almost like it's an offering. Like death was an offering. And there was this dance back and forth with the fear. And then also the knowing that it's just there to support you in your process. And the human in me, yeah, human Crystal, very scared and anxious. But there was another voice, another feeling in me that was like, it's actually okay, this energy, and you can handle this.
It's very fascinating. And I do believe, or I'm very intrigued by the many worlds theory. And there's a part of me that definitely leans more to believing in that possibility, just given when you think about the quantum nature where we're presented with infinite possibilities and we can choose, I guess, what we want to manifest into our reality, or I guess in the many worlds theory, into a specific timeline. But I think in many ways, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm also thinking about death as a metaphor in terms of the death of who you were prior to that experience. Because it's fair to say that you probably left that experience feeling like a new, more upgraded version of yourself. Like you said, I think your near-death experience was also a catalyst for SoulPod, the app that you created. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. What is SoulPod, and what is your intention and vision for this app?
Mm. I love what you just said, the death of the old me, because that resonates so deeply. I was going in a direction in my life which was very successful. I was in biotech, had lots and lots of really exciting things happen in my career, could get any job in that space that I wanted. So on paper, it made so much sense. And at the point where I had that experience, I was very conflicted. I was like, I should be going in this direction. This is what I've worked my entire life to get to this point. And now that I'm here, I'm having second thoughts. So I was frustrated at the time as far as my purpose, but this experience cleared the slate. It just was like a big reset button, physically, mentally, spiritually. And it created, even though I was very difficult to go through, it created this space for me to really get clear on, okay, you have this time. What are you going to do with it? What really lights you up? And I had been so fascinated in the decade prior to this. My awakening really started to accelerate in 2012, along with a lot of people. And I had been meditating every day and doing breath work and Kundalini yoga. And I was like, I think I want to do something in this space, because if I can help more and more people awaken, that's going to infiltrate all areas of our lives, whether you're talking about doing good in climate justice, any other areas in the world. It requires this kind of heart-led state of being. And so I love structure. I love technology. So I wanted to take that knowledge and that interest, and as far as how my brain works, and pair that with spiritual practices. And when I was awakening, there was some really great mindfulness options out there. There's some really great foundational apps and teachings that you can go into. But I wanted to take people a bit deeper into the mystical, balance it with the science where we can, but also reintroduce and allow people to access those elevated states of being for themselves. So SoulPod is very much a structure for awakening. And so we understand where somebody's at in their spiritual journey in our onboarding, and then pair them with a spiritual journey that might be most relevant for where they're at in their spiritual development right now. And then over 21 rituals, 3 weeks, each day builds upon the next, and it's very intentional. And it helps to deliver you to a point where you can go into unfocused expansion on your own and start to access this wisdom that already lives within you. We're just giving you some structure to go deeper. And that's really what I wanted to help us do as a collective at this point.
Which is why when I was doing research ahead of this interview and just looking deeper into SoulPod, I really appreciate the concept and the intentionality behind helping people kind of up level in their consciousness. To your point, there are a lot of apps out there that help with mindfulness, right? And helping people develop a daily spiritual practice. But I think what's very interesting about what you're doing with SoulPod is, yes, that is very good, but you're taking it a step further, right? You're getting deeper, and people have the ability to intentionally become more self-aware, become more conscious without it having to be a forced experience, which is something that you've talked about as well, and kind of alluding to or alluding back to your near-death experience where you were on a certain path and you were going a certain way with the work you were doing in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. And then, of course, you have this experience, you're activated in a different way, and it's almost a forced change, a forced transition, right? Which that path is oftentimes is pushing you towards spiritual evolution and just more heightened consciousness. And I actually do want to talk about that a little bit, right? Because a lot of the work you do with SoulPod is focused on elevating consciousness, right? So there's something that you've talked about in terms of this idea of embracing change as the catalyst for these sort of awakenings. And there are different types of awakenings. There are four different types. So we have the subconscious awakening, the conscious awakening, superconscious, and cosmic consciousness. And I kind of want to walk through all of those stages with you and break that down. But before we get there, I just want to hear more about your thoughts around forced transitions and why it's important for us to embrace that. Because I do find myself, it's kind of a selfish question, because I do find myself right now in a place where it's a forced transition. I got laid off a couple months ago from my 9 to 5 job, and like basically thrown into the wilderness, and I'm having all these things come up again. I want to start there because I think a lot of people can relate to what I'm experiencing right now in this
Yeah.
current climate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And congratulations. You're working with the unknown in a whole new way. And that was one of the big things that I learned, is to develop a relationship with the unknown, which for me was very challenging because I'm a Virgo. I love a plan and I love to know where I'm going, just like anybody else. But our brains are wired for the known. They're wired for what we can recognize. And the awakening journey is wiring you for the unknown, for the mystical, which by definition you can't predict. It always meets you in a new and expansive way. And for people that are at that precipice, like yourself, where you're starting to notice things are shifting in your outer world, and that for me was very much the case, especially as my Kundalini was awakening. And every time I would have some sort of spiritual breakthrough, my external life would shift in ways that were sometimes very difficult, not just the near-death experience. And so when you mention this kind of forcefulness from the external world, I think it's introducing an additional level of choice, a opportunity to really surrender. I don't know if you've read The Surrender Experiment, but that book's coming forward for me to mention that. And there's a lot of times what will happen too is you double down into the known. That's like the human reflex. It's okay, lost my job, need to find the new job, and it needs to look this way. And I think what the universe is asking of us, or what life is asking of us in those moments, is to take a beat. And it sounds so obvious, but it is very difficult to do in practice, which is to take a step back, go deeper into your practice, access those states, that nonlinear state. And so many times, if you do that consciously, it's like you start to meet the flow of life, that river, that there's already a momentum that is in play, and you can start to flow with it rather than paddle upstream. And for me, that's what I noticed, is that those times in my life where you feel exhausted, where you feel like you're fighting for something and things just are not clicking in, that's when I know I'm swimming upstream against the natural momentum. And when I just let go and I just let myself float, then any action that I'm taking is very aligned with my heart space. And that has always served me. And I can say, since my experience, my life has moved in ways I could never have anticipated. And it continues to. And I have absolutely no doubt now that I'm right where I need to be. So you can meet that moment. You can find that alignment.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you're on a path and things are going, you can predict your day, you can predict the next couple of months, you can plan for the future, you can project out into the future. And when I guess your sense of security is stripped away from you, you have no choice but to let go, but to surrender, right? Because you're again thrown into this wilderness, right? You're thrown into a space where you've never been in before. And this is not necessarily just the loss of a job. It could be so many different things that
So many.
happen in your life that force you into a space that you've never had to be in before. To your point about just meeting the experience and releasing control and being in the flow, because you're right, when you lose control you want to double down on control. And something that this experience has taught me so far is the power of being in the present. And a lot of people talk about the power of now,
Mm.
but it's different when you are aware of something on a theoretical level and on your day to day you try to be in the now, but it's different when you don't have a choice but to be in the now. And I'll talk to friends and family and I'm like, you know what's so fascinating about this is I don't know where I'm going to be next week. I don't know where I'm going to be in a couple of months. I literally cannot plan for the near future because I I don't have a steady flow of income right now, so I can't plan for the near future. So I'm forced to be so present, and I can see my life already changing in so many different ways. And I can see that this is definitely like a cosmically, divinely orchestrated pivot or change for me because I don't think certain things that have come up to the forefront of my consciousness would not have if I was still kind of, on the other path, right? Okay. So now I want to talk about the different stages of consciousness because I am very fascinated by that. And awakening doesn't just happen all at once. There's stages and levels to it. And I think talking about the different stages of consciousness or awakening ties into talking about the different stages of awakening, right? So, starting with the subconscious, can we talk about that part of awakening and what are we typically awakening to on that level?
Yeah, I love this conversation because I think it actually ties into what we were just talking about, which, and right now we're in a period of time too where so many people, because as a collective, we're moving through increasing amounts of unknown. And so this responding versus reacting, not just with your nervous system, but with your consciousness, is going to be such a superpower right now in this time. And so I'm excited for everyone that even though we're getting discombobulated in so many ways, if you can go within and meet that present moment, like you talk about, which is, I'm glad we talk about it so much because it is the only thing that really exists, right? Is the present moment. Then you will align with right where you're supposed to be. But the subconscious, so I view the subconscious kind of realm of consciousness as being the room that's dark or the cavern that there is no light in. And so you're simply unaware that it even exists. And this is an ongoing level of consciousness. Like for me, even though I've been meditating for over a decade, I'm constantly becoming aware of that which I was previously unaware of. And so, in this part of the awakening process, you're simply turning the light on just a little bit. And you're starting to see in that cavern, you're starting to see some shadows. You're starting to see some things that you were not aware of. And sometimes those will be things that you don't like. Oh, I did not know I was holding that belief. I did not know that was a thought that has been running in the back of my mind for possibly my entire life. And so during this point, this experience, which is ongoing, you have to give yourself a lot of grace. There's nothing wrong with you if you see something or feel something that's difficult or that you're surprised by. This is when you really have to also dial up simultaneously the self-love and that it's okay and all of it is perfect. And by simply turning the light on and simply seeing that in your own mind, in your experience, the transformation is already happening. People ask me this a lot. They're like, I didn't realize that I have so much resentment in my experience. And I don't want to meditate because then I see that resentment and I don't want to see it. So I'm like, but you're aware of it. You've called it something. So you're already doing the work. You're already on the way. And that's really how I view the subconscious realm. And then we can talk about as far as like when you start to open those additional abilities of perception, you may be able to start to interact with entities that you maybe haven't or interacted with before because you're opening up that door.
Okay, would love to talk about the entities there, but
Mm-hmm.
before we even get there, so it sounds a lot to me like the subconscious realm is when people first awaken to their inner child, because there's a lot of inner child discourse online and everybody's talking about it. And it's when people realize, oh, okay, I have anger issues when someone, I don't know, holds up a coffee to my nose because I had to smell a lot of coffee when I was a child. I'm just making stuff like an arbitrary
But
example.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's it. It sounds a lot like that's what you were describing. And let me know if you agree with that or if I'm oversimplifying it. And I,
I no, I
Mhm.
think that's a really beautiful connection that you make because so much of our subconscious has been shaped by our early years, by our human experience. And so this is very much a human realm. So the inner child makes a lot of sense that this is part of the subconscious for sure.
Okay. And when you talk about entities, people being when they reach this level of consciousness, being able to perceive certain entities, could you talk about that, please?
Yeah, the reason that I mention that is because for me, I started perceiving ghost and disembodied consciousness, which I did not grow up perceiving. And all of a sudden, I was seeing things at the end of my bed. I was seeing very just innocuous ghosts that just walking around with my human eyes. For the scientist in me, that was very interesting because I was like, okay, I'm observing consciousness without a body. And so I think for me, it served a very specific purpose in that it really ignited my curiosity and opened me up to the possibility that consciousness is not local and that it's not just dependent on a body. And over the years, I developed a relationship with that kind of consciousness. And at first, it's a lot of fear. And then I stepped into my power, even meeting some pretty dark entities, very scary stuff that was trying to get into my subconscious. And the cool thing about that and why it doesn't scare me anymore is that it asks for you to step into your power. And the more I stepped into my power and I was like, you cannot mess with my highest self. There's no way. Then those experiences stopped. And I don't experience the darker entities anymore. But it was a very interesting few years.
As you were talking, something popped back into my mind years ago when I feel like I embarked on this like awakening experience. And you talked about the subconscious realm, subconscious mind kind of being like one of the first levels of awakening into a higher consciousness or a higher awareness. I thought about my experience, I think, like I would say about 7 years ago. And when I first was having those awakenings, I did see a lot of darker entities as well, but not in my waking world. They showed up a lot in the dream state. And they would show up as like a black dog who was extremely angry with red eyes, right? Like barking at me and trying to attack me. But every time in the dream, I would overcome this dark entity, right? Like it was filled with a lot of rage, right? So it was, I would say it was probably mirroring to me what I was holding in. And then also, again, when you're waking up to, I guess, certain influences, shadow influences that you're not aware of, I think that was the shadow side of maybe my conscious that I was not aware of coming out in my dreams. So it's interesting because I'm not going to go as far as saying our experiences are the same, but I can relate to what you're talking about perceiving those darker entities, even though I was perceiving mine in the dream state. And I had not thought about that until you were just talking. It literally just
Oh,
popped
cool.
back, slammed back into my mind.
Yeah.
So would you say, you said that you were seeing what was the word? Disembodied,
Disembodied consciousness.
yeah,
Yeah.
disembodied consciousness and other sort of darker entities. Do you
Hmm.
think that was like your shadow self, or were those separate from you, or did they mirror you?
I think that's such a good question. I do wonder if it is a reflection of our subconscious, of our shadow selves. We are all connected. So, on some level, it has to be. But on some level, you could still say we're separate, we're having different experiences. But there feels like there's a relationship there, that there is a, and really, when I had my breakthrough, the last experience I had was a very intense, very scary experience. And I sent this entity love, and I was like, I see you. I see you. And I know you're here. And I know you're trying to fulfill your needs in some way. But this is not the space or time for you. And it was such an interesting experience because I felt it acknowledge me in that way. And then it left, and I slept like a baby that night. It was really wild. And it was as scary as anything you could write in like a horror film. But I found my power and my relationship to it.
Again, it's just so fascinating having these conversations because I think this really clues us into the fact that we really are spiritual beings having a human experience. And there's so many unseen influences and forces are that we are influenced by from our own being that we probably created that we're not aware of, and like other things out there in the universe that we're still intertwined with that are supposed to help us along this spiritual growth. Because again, people might hear us having this conversation talking about dark entities, whether in our waking world or in our dream state, and think, oh my God, these are demons. And I didn't necessarily see the ferocious black dog in my dream with red eyes as a demon. It was representing those shadow and dark emotional states that I was not aware that I was harboring. And in the
Mm,
dream, me overcoming it was symbolizing that in the waking world, at least for me, that I would be overcoming and become more aware of those parts of me that need more integration, more healing, more acknowledgement. Just all
mhm.
very fascinating. Okay, so now I want to go to the second level of awakening into a more heightened state of awareness. And this is just the conscious realm.
We can kind of understand this one probably more intuitively than some of the other realms of consciousness. But this conscious realm, I really view this as clearly it's our human experience, it's our 3D reality. It's a representation of what it is that we have created for ourselves in this lifetime. And I view the continuing like expansion of the conscious experience as bringing more and more soul into this dimension of space and time. And so That's how I think about it on my personal journey. I'm like, how much of my soul, how much of this like elevated experience of oneness and other elevated states of being, how much of that can I bring into the conscious experience? And that's my personal kind of mission, is how much of that can I materialize now in this experience? And your world in the conscious realm here is such a barometer for how much you're in alignment with who it is you came here to be. Your soul is this perfect wholeness, nothing can mess with it. It's infinite and whole. And this experience in the human realm, the conscious experience, is a fractal of that wholeness, and for the reasons of growth and learning. And so I really think of it as like refining this facet of my soul as much as I can. And then you merge back with that diamond, or whatever you want to call it, this kind of like multi-dimensional consciousness. And it's like dimensions upon dimensions, speaking of your podcast. That's how I think about the conscious experience. And I very much think of myself as a co-creator with this life force, this loving intelligence.
Okay, so if the subconscious realm, the first state of awareness, right? And I know there's like sub levels within these like categories. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
know
Yeah.
I'm oversimplifying a lot of this, but I just want to make sure the audience gets what we're talking about. So the subconscious is more of us awakening to our shadow side and battling it out with our shadow self. The conscious realm is more aligned with the intention behind what we do, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
how we choose to live our lives, what we eat, how we relate to others. There's a intentionality there because now we're aware of our shadow selves, right? We've probably
Mm-hmm.
integrated that, and now we are probably awakening to a higher sense of purpose, right? And wanting to, in essence, give back to a way in a way, and also take stock of what we've created for ourselves in this
Yeah.
three-dimensional reality. So being intentional about what we're co-creating with the universe for ourselves and how we show up in the world and how we interact with other people. Is that a fair assessment of what you just talked
Yeah,
about?
yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it. Another way to put it is that might be even more accessible for people is the thoughts you think and the emotions you're having and the words you're speaking and the silence that you're embracing and how you navigate relationship. Both, this is not just with yourself, it's also with your human experience at this point. So, yeah, that's another way to think of it, is increasing awareness of how you're moving about the world.
So is this also where people start understanding or getting more into karmic patterns and understanding potentially past lives and larger patterns? Is this the realm of awakening that people start to understand that?
Yeah. So if we go back to the dark room or cavern, where in the subconscious realm, you're just turning that dial of the light up and you're seeing a few shadows and you're seeing, and then in the awakening in the conscious realm, you're turning that up higher and higher and you're seeing more. And you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was a possibility. And so it's an ongoing process of dialing up that light. And you start becoming aware, like you're saying, of not just how you're moving about the world in this experience, but how you're moving about space and time. And then that brings in other dimensional, other timelines, if you will. You can start to become aware of that. Yeah, for sure.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about the superconscious. So, for those listening, we just talked about the subconscious realm. We talked about the conscious realm, and these are, in essence, analogous to different levels of awakening, right? If you want to look at it that way. So, now we're talking about the superconscious realm. What happens here in this level of awakening?
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is that you have that moment of oneness, of everything, like you mentioned this earlier, where there's a transition from a belief that something is true, and we can work with the belief of oneness, that we are all connected. And this transitions in that moment to a knowing. There is a knowing, there's a felt experience. You're never the same after that experience. Once you've opened the door to this elevated state of consciousness, you're forever changed because you know that exists now. You know that's a possibility, and you want to experience more of it. At least that was my experience. And so that super conscious state is becoming aware of reality in a new way. So your perception changes because your awareness has changed. And with that knowing, it infiltrates everything in your life. Because how can you look at relationships the same? How can you look at your job the same? How can you look at the earth the same after you've had that experience of oneness? And so in the superconscious realm, you realize that time and space are really just constructs. They're a way that we are perceiving and interacting with this experience, but they're not definite states. They're not real. And you start to want to experience more of that, and you can evolve into that superconscious state. And that's really awakening. That's self-realization, or I like to call it soul realization, realizing that you are a being of light and infinity, and you're not just your human body. And maybe you're also realizing that your energy centers are real. They're not just something that so many cultures have and religious traditions have pointed to. They're very real. It's this, I like to think of it as a highway between the physical and the non-physical. And so you start to realize yourself as a non-physical being, as a being of pure consciousness.
It almost sounds like you start to also realize that you're limitless. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Unbounded. Yeah.
Unbounded. And as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about conversations I've had on this podcast in relation to the 5D, because a lot of people talk about that. And throughout several conversations, my understanding of the 5D is this understanding of, like you said, oneness, and not necessarily seeing things as black or white. So to your point, you see more nuance with the way the world's and this reality is set up. And like you said, you don't see relationships the same way. You don't see your job the same way. You don't see yourself the same way. There's just this heightened sense of awareness. Is that a fair assessment of the super conscious realm, or is it a bit more than that?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. And it's like the ocean with the superconscious realm, there's varying degrees of immersion in it, just like with other realms of consciousness. So at first, you're dipping your toe into it and you're like, ooh, what was that? Then you can start to immerse your entire being into it. And then that's, I think, as we move into cosmic consciousness, that's the process of immersion into that state of being.
Okay. And I definitely want to touch on cosmic consciousness because I'm fascinated by what that is, because I think I have a good grasp of the subconscious, conscious, superconscious, and I feel like I've had certain experiences that could speak to these different dimensional states. But before we get into the cosmic consciousness part of things, I want to know, at the superconscious level, do people see entities at this level as well? Are there entities that show up for people at this stage of awakening?
Yeah, such a good question. I think there's entities at any level of consciousness that you can access, but certainly as you awaken into these more elevated states of consciousness, the beings that you can interact with become more elevated. So there are beings that you're just not going to perceive because they only operate in love and above as far as a vibration or frequency. And so in order to interact with them, you're having to raise your frequency to certain levels. And I'm sure there's beings that I have not even yet perceived at this point, but I have had such a deeply personal and meaningful relationship with some of these highly evolved beings. And they start to come into your experience as almost like spiritual midwives. They're there to help you, and they're invested in your awakening and they're excited that you're starting to enter these realms of consciousness that they inhabit and work with. And yeah, it's a very long answer potentially, but the short answer is for sure.
Okay. So if in the subconscious realm, we're seeing more shadow type beings, the conscious realm, perhaps we didn't talk about it too quickly, but we didn't talk about it too much, but I'm assuming the conscious realm is probably when you start becoming more aware of spirit guides potentially. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
the superconscious potentially could be angels. I know it's not like a clean put this in one bucket versus the other bucket versus the other bucket. I
Yeah.
know they bleed into each other, but I'm
Mhm.
just curious and for the listeners to get a sense of, okay, and maybe think for themselves when they're thinking about how they're evolving on a conscious level, what beings they're becoming more aware of.
Yeah, I love this conversation. Yeah, I think spirit guides, which can be ancestral, they can be guides of other origins. A lot of times that's what people first connect with. So I think you're correct in tying that to the awakening consciousness realm. So you're starting to become aware of your subconscious, and you might still be interacting with ghost and some of the darker stuff can pop back up from time to time. We're all like vacillating on this spiral of consciousness. But yeah, the spirit guides were a big thing for me. That was the first guides or non-physical beings of light and love that had an interest in helping me that I connected with. And so I think that's fair to say that you can usually connect with those in the beginning part of your awakening process.
All right, so now I'm super excited to talk about cosmic consciousness. What is the state of awakening, and what are the experiences people will feel or experience in this state of consciousness?
First of all, I'm still exploring it. Probably will be for the rest of my life, but and beyond. But cosmic consciousness, as far as how I understand it, and through some very powerful teachers, is a full immersion into that field of oneness. I think this is also an experience, if you want to tie it to energy centers, this is like a crown center experience. It requires an incredible amount of trust and faith because it very much is like you're leaving everything that you have known, not just the little things at this point, but everything that you have known yourself as well, your ego, your sense of roles and who it is that you are. You're leaving crystal behind and you're fully merging with this oneness. And it's almost like beyond ego death. If you've ever had experience of ego death, it's that and it's ego death plus a full surrender into which can be scary. It's like pure blackness, it's nothingness, and then it's also everything at the same time. Pure loving awareness. And you likely don't even have a sense of yourself at that point because the self has been left behind.
As you were talking, I thought about two guests that I had on the show that kind of talked about these mystical experiences that they had. One woman, she was doing the dishes, and all of a sudden it feels like all her surroundings just faded away. And she just was this like almost particle in space and time, to your
I'm getting
point. Like,
chills.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
bringing me back.
yeah. It was, oh,
Yeah.
you've had a similar experience?
Yeah, yeah.
Can you talk about that if you don't mind?
Ooh, yeah, I can feel it in my body. Yeah, I've had multiple experiences where it almost feels like you fractal into everything. That's the best way I can describe it. And it's a little difficult on the physical body because your body's, wait, where are you going? And it's everything is shifting around you. If you've seen those movies like Marvel movies where they're in other dimensions and everything's shifting and changing, very disorienting, very intense, but the most connected experience of oneness in the physical body, still having some awareness of the physical body, but a completely new interaction with reality. It's hard to put words to that, but it took me a while to recover from it as well. It was pretty intense.
Yeah, I'm just so intrigued. I'm intrigued by a lot of what we've been talking about. But yes, exactly what you described is what they described. Like after having that experience, for the women I was just talking about, it was a split second, right?
Mm,
If we were to time it in human terms, it felt like forever, but she could
mhm.
tell if someone was timing that, it probably was just a few seconds, but it took a while for her to recover from that. And then this other guy that I had on the show talked about he was on a retreat. He like stepped outside after a long period of meditation and he just blended into his environment. Like he was the car, he was the ground, he was the tree,
Yeah.
he was everything. And it was so disorienting for him. It was
Ooh,
like he was
yeah.
very shook by it. And to your point, we talked about this, I think, at the super conscious level where you just have this knowing, right? It's no longer a belief system. Oh, I believe this is a possibility. It's just this deep, profound knowing, which I think kind of layers into the cosmic consciousness realm that you just talked about, right? Where it's not just knowing now you're just experiencing the knowing, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, ooh, it got chills on that. Experiencing the knowing, I think is a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whew. Yeah, I can imagine how disorienting that must feel for anyone
Yeah.
who experiences that, but also so deeply and deeply and deeply profound. So, we've been talking a lot about the different levels of consciousness, the different realms of consciousness. I think we need to take a step back and talk about what consciousness is, right? From your perspective, and I think this is an ongoing topic that people are trying to get to the bottom of like properly explaining. But you said something that was very interesting earlier, where you said that as you were awakening, you realized that consciousness was not just housed in the body, right? Again, what is consciousness and where do you think it's housed?
Ooh, where do I think it's housed? I think consciousness is awareness, and I think it exists in everything. I think that it is both what we're perceiving and the perceiver, the witness and the witnessing. From a scientific perspective, I think it's getting very exciting because in the last year, we now know that quantum states are sustained in the brain, which previously we didn't think was possible because the brain is wet and moist and doesn't seem to have the capacity to stabilize quantum states. But we now know that it does in microtubules, and that is igniting such a exciting conversation between quantum physicists and neurobiologists. And I think the next few years are going to be very interesting as far as scientifically explaining consciousness. But that makes so much sense to me because quantum physics is a non-local, non-linear physics. It's a physics of probability and possibility. And that makes a lot of sense to me when it comes to my own experience of what consciousness is. So I do not think that it's limited to the brain. I think that we are a vessel for this consciousness and that our brains are like, I like thinking of it as one of those old timey TVs when we're turning the dial and we can change what it is that we're perceiving based on our frequency. I think that the brain helps us do that. And it's, at least in this lifetime, that's where it's housed, but only partially. So our consciousness and awareness as our soul and our highest self is existing, not limited to the body. And we can entangle, I think it's actually entangling with other information in the field. And that's how consciousness works, at least from my current understanding.
Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned the brain being able to house quantum states. And just for the listeners, so
Mm.
that they fully understand, what are quantum states?
Quantum states. So they are states of possibility. So these are states where we don't know whether it's spinning up or down, but once we become aware of it, it becomes a state that we have observed. And that's why so many spiritualists talk about where your focus goes, your energy flows. It's the same kind of concept. And that seems to be supported by quantum physics. But we can also talk about entanglement, which is one particle, they had a relationship that's at one point in time and then across time and space. Those particles still have a relationship, which is super trippy because we think of time and space as being a limiting factor for relationship. And then you have superposition, multiple states at one time. So it starts to get very trippy very fast in the quantum physics world.
It's all very fascinating and stuff that I'm still trying to wrap my head around in
I think
reading.
everyone
So,
is.
yes, of
Yeah.
course, of course.
I listened to a quantum physicist who is a professor. And he said to his new set of students, he was like, in a few weeks, you'll understand how much you don't understand quantum physics. So it's not just us.
And that is the beauty of being a lifelong student and constantly discovering things. Okay, so speaking of consciousness, right, I want to tie this back to the Soul Pod, where I think with that app, you see yourself as someone being at the forefront of soul tech. Love that name, by the way. But of course, we live in a world that we're literally submerged in so much tech. And you believe that technology can really be used as a highway to higher consciousness, right?
Mm.
Why do you believe that, especially in the state of AI becoming a huge thing, right? And even people questioning the consciousness of AI. Do you
Mm.
really think that tech can really be one of the tools that we can use as a path towards higher consciousness?
Yeah, I think it can be one. I don't think it's the only. And the amazing thing about technology, and this goes for like biotechnology and all kinds of technology, is that it can be a tool for awakening if we want it to be. And if it's being designed by people who are designing and developing and creating from their hearts and from their own alignment. And so I think that's really first and foremost when it comes to AI development, when it comes to any new technology or tool. It's really important, and this is really important personally for me, that this is coming forth from a place of love and of connection and my highest self meeting the highest selves of others. And then in that realm, in that possibility, I think technology can be incredibly potent. I think AI could be incredibly potent for helping us, almost like a mirror to our highest selves, and can help illuminate what it is that we might not see about ourselves either, like a subconscious illuminator. But I do also have my concerns. I live in San Francisco, so I'm hearing all kinds of chatter around this development, and I do get nervous about it as well, especially on the AI side, because in biotech we have all kinds of ethical, moral structure around the development of health related technologies. And I think we need a lot of that around AI as well. That conversation needs to be happening. And the development of AI is happening so fast. I don't think people are aware of it. So this conversation is incredibly important.
Absolutely. I think with many things, if not all things in life, it just depends on, it boils down to intention, right? So on one hand, we can villainize technology in many ways, especially with the rise of AI, or we could look at it as a tool that we can also use for the betterment of humanity, not just from a materialistic sense, but also from a deeper, soulful, spiritual sense. However, to your point, the lack of regulations is worrisome, and the larger effects on our consciousness as a society, because a lot of the apps that we're on in terms of social media apps and stuff like that, we're bombarded with so many things that are being planted into our subconscious. And there's constantly the shadow part of humanity that's emerging or being fed into. And I think AI is going to be very interesting. AI is going to play a very important role in testing humanity's ability to choose the soulful and spiritual side of us and not release that and give into the more, I
Yeah.
guess, technological transhumanist side of us. It seems like that's where we're going.
I think you're talking about an important point here, which is where do we place our power?
Yeah.
And when we start to give our power away to AI, or I think the most important thing, and this is what we're helping people do in SoulPod, is to realize that this technology within yourself, it is a technology that you can activate. And it is more powerful than any AI, than any biotech tool. This inner technology, this awakening of your consciousness it's I think that's why we're here, is to awaken that. And so I hope that people remember that when it comes to all the changes that we're going through. And I don't think it's a coincidence that AI is being born now with the awakening that is happening on the planet and all these other changes. I think it's all for a very powerful reason. But first and foremost, I hope people don't forget that they have the power. And to awaken that inner technology is going to serve you more than anything.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads me into a concept that I think ties into everything we're talking about right now, which is the concept of the new earth and spiritual development. Obviously, you work in spiritual development, but I want to know if this work is also part of ushering people into a new earth. And for the listeners, could you just also give an overview of what the new earth is and before you answer my initial
Yeah,
question?
a new earth. So I think of the new earth as a experience where humanity has prioritized awakening as an intention, as a collective intention. I think simply through that intention and the prioritization of it by a large portion, whatever that portion ends up being, of humanity, I think that ushers in. And I do think it is being ushered in. And then with that awakening, with that transformation, with that increased awareness, with the subconscious no longer calling all of the shots, I think a completely different human experience on the planet is possible. And so when people are talking about this new earth, that's how I see it. Is it a very new and powerful and harmonious experience for humanity? And as that happens, as we develop a deeper relationship with ourselves first, then with others, and with the planet that we're inhabiting, I think this also opens up a relationship with our galactic brothers and sisters who are waiting for us to awaken to that possibility. So it's a very exciting possibility, and I think it's very much on the way.
Very exciting indeed. I've really enjoyed our conversation and just
Cool.
talking about the different levels of consciousness and talking about those different realms. And again, this is something we can get deeper and deeper into, but I think we did a great job just covering it today. Thank you
Mm-hmm.
so much. I have to
Thank
ask
you.
you, have you shifted in perspective on anything recently? And this is something I ask all my guests at the end of the show because I think we're constantly shifting. So would love to hear any sort of new perspectives you have. And it could be as lighthearted or as deep as you would like it to be.
Such a good question. I think I've been shifting in perspective lately is truly what is possible. I think even with all of my work and what is possible, it's so funny how my human can still limit it. And my experience, even in the last week, has really expanded my understanding of what is possible. And I'm just even more heart opened and trusting in the universe to meet me halfway than I was even a month or two ago. And so that is an ongoing shift in me.
I relate to that shift so much. Everything you said, I resonate with 1,000,000%. Again, thank you so much, Crystal, for being on the show today. Where can people
Thank you,
find
Jimmy.
you if they want to connect with you or download your app?
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you for having me. I've had so much fun. This is what I like talking about, and so excited to be here with you. But you can find us at soulpodapp.com. You can find us on the iOS App Store, SoulPod. We're working on Android. I know we're working on it. We'll get there probably towards the end of the year. And you can also check out our retreats coming up in August, end of August in Joshua Tree. There's a few spots open. It's going to be a really beautiful deep dive into a lot of what we talked about here today. And Instagram, we're on Instagram as well. And thank you so much for your journeying with me today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to leave all the links to everything you just said in the show notes. Again, such a pleasure. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Jimmy.